Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Papaya Mejorado wash processed Ecuador from 1/2 Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And 1/2, based out of Petaling, Jaya, Malaysia. And they were a suggestion to us by Oh Boy, Oh Boy, Oh Boy. So shout out to and thank you to Oh Boy, Oh Boy, Oh Boy for the suggestion. This is 1/2's first ever appearance on this channel, as they're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. This coffee was also part of Airworks' September coffee drop, and the best way to get me excited about trying a coffee roaster for the first time is for them to release a Mejorado coffee, as not only does it give me an opportunity to review a Mejorado, but it also gives me an opportunity to compare and contrast it to the other Papaya Mejorados that we've reviewed this year, as I do believe it's the coffee that we've reviewed the most this year up to this point. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how this one compares, as this right here is day 47. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind roast profile for this coffee. So it is interesting going into this review. I was trying to figure out where I wanted to place them on the spectrum, as the only other Malaysian coffee roaster that we've reviewed up to this point is Weston Gopi, and Weston Gopi definitely roasts notably lighter than 1/2. So the other comparison I had was with the other Papaya Mejorados that we've reviewed this year, and I do have to say that the Resident one is still the most developed, with this one probably being the second most developed of those Papaya Mejorado coffees. That being said, I'm not saying that it's an overly developed coffee. If anything, I feel like it probably skews a little bit more on the developed side of that light medium in terms of that roast profile. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 21, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the cup was notably different from the other Papaya Mejorados that we've reviewed this year, as this one had a surprisingly high focus on the citric attributes of the cup. It is a little bit bitter, but notably in the citric directions. Additionally, there are some dark berry aspects present with plenty of sweetness, so a lot of the Mejorado qualities were still present within this one. That being said, I was kind of curious about the direction that this one started in, but we will see how that transitions, as on day 24, we opted for the Chemex, and this was definitely a better second impression, as it was offering a better level of sweetness and a much more even cup, especially in terms of the citric direction. So it's entirely possible that that first try could have been a brewing error, but outside of that, the coffee itself did not necessarily yield the best results on the cool down, as it did lose a fair bit of its structure. Overall, it was a better day. However, this coffee from the first two impressions definitely didn't necessarily have the best structure to it. Day 27 through the April brewer, and this is the best the coffee had been to this point, as surprisingly it's best off brew, with it continuing to offer a nice level of sweetness reminiscent of what I would describe as being white Lifesaver gummies. And that's honestly the best descriptor I had of this coffee, mostly because it was sweet and it continued to offer that flavor profile for a majority of the time that we were actually consuming this one. Plenty of citrus. The cup does continue to lose its structure on the cool down, with a bit of heaviness in that cool down once again, and that's a little atypical for these coffees, as the majority of Mejorados that we've reviewed seems to really improve as the cup itself does cool down, but this one being significantly better right off brew was a little bit of a change of pace for me. Day 30 through the V60 with lower temperatures, and the coffee itself was the best it had been to this point, as it was offering the most amount of that Mejorado sweetness. Once again, I often describe it as being a little bit more of a brown candy sort of aspect. Other people describe it as being a sweeter honeyed component to it. The cup does have a notably better bit of sweeter fruits in line with the listed citric aspects once again, and some slight herbality. So this one was a better day, and I thought that was a result of us kind of adjusting the temperatures. As I've said in the past, Mejorados do seem to benefit from lower extraction adjustments in general. Day 33 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the biggest takeaway I had was that the coffee was once again notably better right off brew, as the cool down continues to yield such mixed results. The base continues to remain much more citric forward, with subtlety to the rest of the fruit profile, a little bit more herbal in terms of the just overall qualities of this one, as well as some darker berry aspects yet again. Day 36 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee is interestingly the best it had been to this point, as it does offer once again that white Lifesaver gummy-like feel. While there are some slightly harsh aspects to the finish, it is notably more even than it had been on some of the other days. day 39 through the Chemex, and there was a little bit of inconsistency with this one as it wasn't quite as good as the previous day. Still best off brew, darker berry feel once again. This time, once again, the cup does skew a lot into the harshness as it did cool down. And then on day 42 through the V60, and it was back to being its best as it does have a nice level of the expected sweetness and good balance as there's a slightly bitter citrus, a slightly sugary stone fruit, and a slight wininess that's a little bit more reminiscent of that white Lifesaver gummy-like feel. And when I say wininess, it isn't necessarily in terms of a fermenty or funky sense. It just has that sort of, I don't want to describe it as being the flavor profile, but I think they have a white grape list on here, and that's kind of what I'm seeing from this one as it has a little bit of that feel. Additionally, some tea-like herbality is present yet again with a slightly more robust base. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 3 level 4s, so let's go through those. And we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. So even with this one having a little bit more of those robust qualities, even with that having a little bit of harshness, and even with this one being not necessarily the most well-balanced coffee, I do have to say that it still offered enough cleanliness to justify that level 4 mark. Though truth be told, it didn't necessarily make it that easily. It is probably on the lower side of level 4, and definitely not to the same extent as the majority of the Papaya Mejorados that we've reviewed this year. Finish, level 4. And I was hoping for a lot better of a finish because the best part of the Mejorado coffees for me has been that sweet, intense finish that they usually do offer, especially in terms of the sugary sense. And for whatever reason, the sugariness and a lot of sweetness came at the forefront of this coffee, and the finish itself was oftentimes bitter, harsh, and once again, that could be a brewing error. It could have been on me, but regardless of what sort of adjustments I made, it continued to be an ever-present theme within this coffee, with the exceptions of some of the later days that did seem to offer a much more better balanced and even coffee. Sweetness level 4, and I do have mixed feelings on it scoring level 4 because usually when it comes to Mejorado coffees, I do want them to score that level 5. Their kind of trademark is that they are extremely sweet, and this one was not quite as sweet as I was hoping. If anything, it seemed to offer it a slight bit more in the fruit sense a lot of the time relative to the other candied, sugary, sweet profiles that the other Mejorado coffees offer. So mixed feelings on that. We move on to the level 3s, and we'll start with the acidity level 3. Not necessarily the brightest coffee, but we go back and forth on this when it comes to discussing Mejorado coffees, that they don't necessarily always end up being the brightest to begin with. So this one's scoring that level 3. It probably could have gone either way. Florality level 3, and I've mentioned before that a lot of people describe this Mejorado sweetness as being honey reminiscent, and I would say that yeah, it does have that slightly floral honey-like feel to it. That being said, the florality was never to the point where I would say it was quite as well pronounced as the other characteristics of this one, and those other characteristics mostly skew on the berry fruit, which is there at the level 3. Can't quite recall whether or not they have any sort of berry fruit list on here. I do know that they have a grape, which is also where the berry fruit goes in for this category specifically. So level 3, yeah, it is one of the more pronounced qualities to it, though not necessarily overly well defined. Citrus fruit, level 3. Once again, it does have a slightly bitter citric quality to it, and I think they have a blood orange note listed on here, which once again makes a lot of sense given that it does have that slightly more bitter tone to this one. Stone fruit, level 3, and I do have to say that of the fruit qualities, that one was definitely my favorite because once again it was offering a little bit more of a sugary stone fruit that did give this coffee a little bit more of that true Mejorado-like feel in that regard. Caramel, level 3, so that of course being that classic Mejorado-like characteristic, but once again having it at the forefront as opposed to the back end is a little unique and different for these coffees. Bitterness, level 3. Yeah, this coffee surprisingly just had a lot of bitterness, especially in terms of the citric qualities to this one. Once again, it could be on me, but I do have to say that none of the other coffees that we were brewing or reviewing side by side with this one seemed to offer that same quality, so not entirely sure what to make of that. Savoriness, level 3, and that definitely is with the more tea-like aspects of this one because I was really surprised. Don't have too many Mejorado coffees that offered this much of a tea-like profile to them, especially in terms of that herbality, which at times wasn't necessarily the most even, so level 3 for that. Body level 3 is the last thing we'll discuss, and once again, that's pretty surprising given that when it comes to these Mejorado coffees, I can't always tell where the body's going to land towards the end. So having this one be a little bit more, we'll say medium bodied, definitely did give this one a little bit more depth. I do kind of wonder how that came into play as a lot of the other Mejorados, Papaya Mejorados didn't score that high. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. Alright, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I think it's pretty safe to say that I enjoyed a lot of the other La Papaya Mejorados a fair bit more than this one, though this one did somewhat redeem itself at the end. As early on with this coffee I said, I'm not necessarily enjoying this one as much as I would have expected. This is, as of this moment, my favorite standard processed offering out there. I mean, we have a standard washed Mejorado coffee, which isn't necessarily a high-end coffee as of this moment. I still feel like we're probably trending in that direction given how good these coffees are. But this one right here, with the expectations that it had, didn't necessarily live up to them on the earlier stages. Though towards the end, I definitely found some bright spots to this one, as it did offer a fair bit more of those qualities. I just don't necessarily think that maybe the profile or the intention of this coffee was set up with my own preferences, which is fine. Not all of these La Papaya Mejorados are going to end up being my favorite. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I think that this one is a little unique and stands out in a different sense. So I think if you like your slightly more citric forward profiles to your coffees while still offering great sweetness, then this one's a really nice fit in that direction. Additionally, it does have a little bit more body and texture to it, and I do have to say that it can be a little bit more even, as nothing within the tasting wheel really stood out too high or even too low, as the tasting wheel itself was relatively well balanced. So in that regard, while at times it wasn't necessarily the most even finishing coffee, it did have a really nice balance for the overall characteristics that you can expect from a cup of coffee. But that's the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the La Papaya Mejorado wash processed Ecuador from 1/2 Coffee. Thank you for watching.